Hey, friends, it is finally time to talk about democracy, a term often used, rarely nailed down. And so I want to talk a little bit today about both how we define democracy and the dangers of doing that in too reductive a way. This seems like a good time to remind you of my first two big lessons of AP CompGov. The first of which is that we are mostly focused on empirical statements and not normative statements here. The second being that the real world does not always fit neatly into the conceptual buckets that we define in this class. Those are important when we talk about democracy for two reasons. Number one, it's pretty common in the United States, it's pretty common in the 21st century to assume that democracy equals good. And I tend to agree with that position. But for the purposes of our class discussions, I want you to be able to say that a country or that a regime, more properly, is good or has advantages without necessarily equating that to democracy, or to say that a regime doesn't fully meet the criteria for democracy without automatically making that an insult or a criticism of that regime. Second, we're going to talk about countries being democratic versus authoritarian. We're going to talk about them being liberal versus procedural democracies. And I don't want you to get super hung up on the lines between those categories because they aren't bright lines. God did not come down from the heavens and command that the definition of liberal versus procedural democracy be engraved in stone tablets. So don't get super hung up. Don't look for a bright line that doesn't exist between those categories. It's much more important that you be able to arrange regimes on a spectrum from democratic to authoritarian than it is that you be able to say this is the box into which Nigeria fits. So, all that said, I'm going to talk about two different sets of criteria that we'll work with this week in order to define democracy. Your textbook, which you will read soon, I hope, if you haven't already, uses three basic criteria to define a liberal democracy, which is the most democratic version of a democracy. Those are that a liberal democratic regime is going to allow for participation in politics by its citizens, for competition between different political views and ideologies and actors, and for liberty for people to go about their daily lives, including disagreeing with the government. Those three things we'll talk about extensively in class, so I'm not going to rehash them here, but it's useful to have that refrain of participation, competition, liberty in your head, because it's going to cover most of the stuff that I'll talk about in this slightly more exhaustive checklist. As is the way with an AP course, sometimes the College Board does come down from on high and dictate to us what they think a democracy is. So I also want to walk you through their criteria. This is going to be useful for the purposes of AP exam taking, but I don't need you to get a tattoo of this information on your forehead. It would be much more useful if you could think about these criteria and use this vocabulary to describe regimes, not necessarily to go down the list and be like, yes, no, 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 not democracy. The first and I think most important thing on the College Board's checklist is this concept called the rule of law, which you'll also read a little bit about in O'Neill. The rule of law incorporates a couple basic concepts. The first is that there should be laws, there should be predictable rules arrived at, usually through some sort of predictable process visible to the people by which the state is governed. In other words, in a state with the rule of law, there isn't just some monarch sitting on a throne dispensing justice saying, I like the cut of your jib, you get a good job, I don't like the way your face looks, you're going to get executed. There should be laws that determine people's fate and the way that they're treated by the government. The second aspect of the rule of law is that the law has to govern everybody. So you shouldn't be able to get out of your traffic tickets, or you shouldn't have a different set of norms apply to you if you're wealthy or if you're powerful or if you're well connected. Those both characterize a state with the rule of law. Second thing is the media should be independent in order for people to be able to contest their views about politics, in order for people to be able to hold their government to account. They need to be able to get information about what the government is doing that isn't just controlled by the government, and so there does need to be some sort of independent media. A third aspect of democracy in the College Board checklist is free and fair elections. And I would argue that this is really the one, it's necessary but not sufficient. But if you don't have free and fair elections, you can stop talking about democracy. So those elections have to involve real competition from multiple different points of view. If people want to put themselves forward as candidates, they have to be fair in the sense that the votes have to get counted. And very importantly, they have to have what's known as universal adult suffrage. So pretty much all citizens over a certain age have the right to vote. Fourth characteristic of a democratic government, or a democratic regime rather, is transparency, which is to say that when the government makes decisions, it should be making those decisions in the public view. In a government that practices transparency, you should be able to know who's in power, you should be able to contact government officials, you should be able to find out which way your representative in the legislature voted on a controversial issue. All of those are aspects of transparency. And you can connect that back to the rule of law because it's really hard to know what rules you're expected to follow if they don't tell you what they are. A fifth thing is that citizens should have a variety of ways of participating in government. And here I want to soapbox for 10 seconds about something that bothers me in American politics really frequently, which is that voting is far from the only important form of political participation. It's important to vote. I will tell you this repeatedly as we're in an election year. But voting isn't the only way of participating. You can also contact your representatives in state, local, and federal government. You can also sign petitions. You can also participate in protests. You can also run for office. You can also participate through a political party. There's lots of different ways to participate. And so in a true democracy, we look for citizens to be able to participate in government through elections and through other avenues as well. One other thing is that in a more democratic country, the branches of government, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, tend to be at least somewhat independent of each other. This is one of those situations where there isn't a clear, bright line, like judges have to have lifetime tenure during good behavior, otherwise it's not a democracy. That's not a thing. We can't get that specific. But in general, in a more democratic regime, we tend to see each branch exercise some amount of independent powers, such that, say, winning the election to the presidency in a real democracy, in a liberal democracy, doesn't give the president the right to do everything and override the legislature and override the judiciary. So we usually look for some degree of judicial, executive, legislative independence, or in other terms, we look for separation of powers. Finally, and O'Neill, I'll send you back to O'Neill for this because he has a few good paragraphs on it. Finally, we look for protection for civil rights and liberties. We look for the government to do some combination of protecting people's freedom of individual action and supporting them or creating environments in which they can actively participate in society. There's lots of philosophical debates, and your textbook will get into this if you haven't read it already, about the difference between the government, the state getting out of people's way versus the state creating an environment in which citizens can actively participate. Both of those can qualify as being civil rights and civil liberties. We'll talk about it a little bit in class if you guys want. But there should be some scope for individual citizen action, and the state should view itself, should take steps to protect that scope of action. One last thing is that in a democracy, the state tends to treat its citizens more or less equally. This doesn't mean that literally everybody gets literally the same things from the state, just that citizens aren't grouped into first and second and third class citizens. And if you know your history of the United States civil rights movement, or if you want to go back to Reconstruction, I think you've probably talked extensively, if you've thought much about US history, about the ways in which equal treatment of citizens is really a prerequisite for a country to be genuinely considered democratic. So, when we start looking at our 6 case study countries, we're going to be confronted with the reality that some of them do some of these things and not others, and so it seems insufficient to just say countries are democratic or authoritarian, which gets back to my overriding point in this course about the insufficiency of buckets for describing the real world. I'm going to give you a couple more nuanced terms, although I'm going to caution you for the third time today that you should not try to cram every country that you encounter into one of these 3 buckets and then yell at anybody who disagrees with you about which bucket it goes in. It doesn't quite work that way. However, political scientists do use 3 terms to describe different sort of points or ranges on the spectrum between democracy and authoritarianism. The first, the sort of most democratic of the democracies, is what we call a substantive democracy, or a liberal democracy, or a consolidated democracy. Those are interchangeable terms for the purposes of AP CompGov. A liberal democracy has free and fair elections with universal adult suffrage. That is the baseline for a democracy. It also has, as O'Neill talks about, different protections for participation in government, for competition in government, and for citizens' liberty. One other thing to note is that usually when we talk about a country being the most democratic of democracies, and the term consolidated democracy implies this, we're usually suggesting that that country has a history of being democracy. It often takes some practice with being democratic, with protecting participation, competition, and liberty, for a regime to really develop kind of the habits, particularly of citizen participation and the traditions that suggest that democracy is really there to stay. So that's the liberal democracy. That's the most democratic of democracies. A little bit further on the scale, towards the authoritarian end of the scale, is what we call a procedural democracy. And this term is not universally used, but O'Neill will talk about it occasionally, and I will talk about it occasionally, and political scientists will talk about it occasionally. So you want to be able to use this term accurately. A procedural democracy is a regime in which there are free and fair elections with universal adult suffrage, but there might be some restrictions on adult suffrage. But in general, it's sort of moving toward the principle that all adult citizens can vote in elections. But there might be some restriction on participation or competition or liberty. So often those regimes tend to be countries that have somewhat recently emerged from authoritarian regimes, or that have somewhat recently emerged from colonial rule. We'll talk about that when we get to Nigeria in particular. And so they have on paper all these protections for democracy, but they might not be fully implemented. Often those countries have a shorter or a more troubled or a more, complicated history of democracy. The final category that we want to talk about is what's known as an illiberal democracy or a hybrid regime. Those terms are both sort of problematic because they don't quite capture what we're talking about, which is a country that has elections, but not really substantive protections for participation, competition, or liberty. In these countries, we'll tend to see elections being rigged, participation being severely limited, many voters being disenfranchised, and or many candidates being excluded from access to the ballot. Or we might see elections for positions that aren't really meaningful, right? So you can elect the county pig catcher, but you can't actually elect any people who make real decisions. So an illiberal democracy or a hybrid regime is really a type of authoritarian regime. And authoritarian is just going to be our catch-all term for not actually democratic. We'll talk about it in a couple of days. Again, there aren't bright lines between these three categories, and we'll have some debates about, say, whether Russia constitutes a procedural democracy or a hybrid regime. But you need to know those three terms, and you need to be just aware where they're situated relative to each other on that spectrum between democracy and authoritarianism. Defining democracy is one of the most important things that we're going to do in this course, even though you're not necessarily going to come out all agreeing with one another on which countries constitute which levels of democracy. So we'll spend the next 2 days of class talking about this and actually practicing it on our 6 case study countries. That's it. Go do your textbook reading. Go take your quiz. I will see you all soon.